morning. You guys are like really awake and peppy and not really hungover like I might expect, so that's cool. Yeah. I actually got up early this morning and went and took pictures of the sunrise on the beach, which is something I've been meaning to do since I got here, but I inevitably never do it because it's always more attractive to stay in bed every morning. But I forced myself up. And I'm glad to be alive this morning because yesterday we went to my family's here with me. We went to St. Augustine, yeah, where the lighthouse is. My wife really wanted to see the lighthouse, so we went out there, but she's afraid of heights, so she wouldn't go up the lighthouse. And my kids, once they saw it, really wanted to go up. And they couldn't go up by themselves, so I had to go with them. And I knew it was a bad idea before I started, and it's one of those things that you know going in it's a bad idea, but then when you're done, you realize it was 1,000 times worse than you expected. But I did not have a heart attack. I felt like I was having a heart attack, and I'm still alive, so that's cool. I'm glad to be here. My name is Jason Awbrey. I'm a Xamarin MVP, a Microsoft MVP from Houston, Texas. It's my first time here at Code on the Beach, so it's a very cool conference. Very nice to be this close to the water. I'm really kind of surprised people show up to sessions because it seems like once you get here, you see the beach, you think, well, screw the sessions. I mean, I'm going to go play on the beach. But so I applaud y'all for sticking with it and actually coming. I'm going to talk about Xamarin. I'm going to talk about this is kind of a quick dive into the Xamarin ecosystem, and the two things I want to walk away with is I want you to have a better understanding of sort of the overall picture of what Xamarin is and what the pieces of Xamarin is. Xamarin is not one single technology. And I want you to have a little better feeling for what the process of coding Xamarin is like. So hopefully I will blow through the slides pretty quickly and get to the coding so you will have a little better feel for what the actual coding experience is like. How many of y'all have actively used Xamarin, have written Xamarin projects? Okay, Mark back there, who's also a Xamarin MVP, has written Xamarin projects. That's good. This is the audience I want. I want people who are interested but have not gotten started and kind of want to know how to take that next step. Well, back up real quick. I run my own consulting shop in Houston called Post.net Consulting. I also partner with a group of guys out of Denver called Venado Technologies to do enterprise consulting. So if any of y'all, professionally are looking to get into Xamarin and need some training, coaching, help, just want someone to talk to, come up here, grab a business card, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll do what I can to help you get started, either ad hoc or on a more formal basis. So this is kind of what drove the idea of this presentation. This is the Xamarin activity on Stack Overflow for the past 6 years. Xamarin as a technology is about 6 years old. And you can see it started off slow, and every year over year there was a gradual increase, a slight jump. And then we get to 2016, and if anyone can possibly guess when build 2016 was, they made the announcement Xamarin is free, and the first two guesses don't count. In March 31st, I think, of 2016, they announced the Xamarin acquisition and the fact that Xamarin was free with Visual Studio. And that day, the number of questions you saw on Stack Overflow about Xamarin spiked, more than twofold, and it's pretty much been at that level ever since. So there's just an incredible amount of new people trying to get into it who aren't quite sure how to get started, have lots of questions. There's definitely a learning curve, and that's kind of where the idea for this presentation came in. Just a back to basics. You're a C# developer, you're a .NET developer, you know that stuff, but you don't know Xamarin. How do you get started? What does it all mean? How does it all fit together? I always like to start off by making this point, and it's a slightly different point than it was a year ago, but Xamarin is not a single thing. Xamarin is not a single technology. It's a group of different technologies, a group of different products that are all produced by Xamarin under the Microsoft umbrella. And the reason I say that is because if you're out there looking for help on the forums, on Stack Overflow, it can be very frustrating for us who are trying to answer questions or trying to help people get started. I'm using Xamarin to do this, I'm using Xamarin to do that, I'm using Xamarin and I have a problem. You need to be a lot more specific about that. Just like Microsoft makes multiple products that allow you to do web stuff, they make multiple products that allow you to do desktop, they make multiple technologies that allow you to do back-end database stuff. Just saying you're using Microsoft to do something is not really enough information. So the same rule kind of applies to Xamarin. And we'll talk about what those different technologies are and how they fit together. And anytime y'all have a question, just raise your hand, yell at me, whatever. I have 3 kids. The idea of having someone yell a question at me is not at all upsetting. And I mean, immediately after this is over, I'm going to hop back in the car with them and start driving to Houston. So as much time as y'all take to answer questions, I would prefer to be here than locked in the car with them again. So this is the kind of traditional model for how the vendors want you to write apps for their platform. Apple wants you to write apps using Objective-C, Xcode, Swift. Android wants you to write apps using Java and Eclipse and Android Studio. Microsoft just wants you to buy a Windows Phone. And this, this is the way they intend it. This is the tools they provide. They all individually provide pretty much free tools to allow you to do this for their platform and their platform only. They very much do not care about the other guy's platform. So from the platform vendor's perspective, this is great. From the developer's perspective, from the enterprise IT perspective, this is not great because the likelihood that your boss is going to come to you and say, I want an app written, a mobile app written, and I only want iOS, I don't care about anything else, is, I wouldn't say it's 0, but it's pretty small. I mean, if you're going to spend the money to develop an app, there's a very high likelihood they're going to want you to support at least iOS and Android. And if you do it from the platform vendor's perspective, if you use their approach, you're going to have 2 times the code base, 2 times the developers, 2 times the training, 2 times the bugs, 2 times the bug tracking, 2 times the everything. And that's just not good from a maintenance perspective, not good from a development perspective. Just really nothing about that is good from an IT development perspective. So the other, kind of the second approach you could use is to do this sort of hybrid app approach where you have basically a web container running on the device, and then you have your app written in HTML and JavaScript, all these web-friendly technologies. And that works, so people do that successfully, and I don't want to completely be dismissive about that, but there's a lot of downsides to it. It doesn't provide a very platform-specific behavior to the user. If I gave an app, my wife is an iOS user, uses her iPhone all the time, uses an iPad, and if I gave her a web app packaged as an iOS app, she would know something was not right about it. She couldn't tell me what it was, she wouldn't be able to be specific, but it would not feel like a native app. It wouldn't have the native look and feel. It would be, something about it would tell her that it was just not quite right. It didn't stick to all the UI guidelines that Apple wants you to use. And an Android user would know would think the same thing. They wouldn't be able to tell you why necessarily, but they would know that it was just not quite right. So it doesn't give you a great user experience. I don't think it's a great developer experience personally. The few times I've ever gone down this road, the debug process for debugging JavaScript within a browser container on a device is just horrible. And I'm not a huge JavaScript fan. It's very good for what it does on the web, and it probably is very good for other things that I don't quite appreciate, but it's not really the language I want to use to write an app, particularly an enterprise app, that has any sort of meat to it. If I was doing something that was going to be quick and dirty and throw away, fine. But it's not, if it has something that's going to be supported for 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years, I don't want to build it on a JavaScript base and have to support that for 10 years. That would not be a good experience for me. So the approach that Xamarin introduced when they first came out about 5, 6 years ago is, and this is, they tend to call it the Xamarin Platform. I think of it sort of as Xamarin Classic, but it's the idea that you could have a shared backend running on all your different devices based on running on the Mono runtime, the .NET runtime. And then for each individual platform, you have a layer on top of that that does the platform-specific stuff and the platform UI. So your business logic and your services and your data and all that stuff is shared across all your projects. Your UI is not. And your platform-specific stuff like notifications and GPS access and that sorts of stuff, camera access, you would have to write per platform. So that gets you a lot more shared code, but also allows you to provide each platform with a platform-specific UI and a platform native behavior. So the user gets from the user's perspective, the app will behave like a native app, but you're getting all the benefits of code sharing for the back end of your project. And for, particularly for like an enterprise or a line of business app, the shared back end could be significant. That's a lot of code there, a lot of business logic. And depending on how your app is designed, this is also code that can be shared with your web app, with your desktop app, with your, your middle tier stuff. So you can get a significant amount of code sharing from doing that approach. This is, well, that's really not very interesting. Windows. This is excuse me. This is just illustrating that for an iOS app, Xamarin is going to provide you with all of the .NET runtime stuff they're used to, XML and Link and System.NET, System.io. Plus, they're also going to provide C# wrappers for all of the iOS-specific SDKs that Apple provides for UIKit and MapKit and beacons and graphics and everything else. Pretty much 100% coverage of all the public APIs that the platform provides, including things like WatchKit. And even they support tvOS now too, if you want to write apps for Apple TV. And it's the same story on Android. All the Android APIs that Google provides, plus all the native System.NET stuff that you're used to as a C# programmer. Anything you can do in Objective-C or Java, you can do with C# and Xamarin. That's the claim Xamarin makes, and in my experience, that is absolutely true. I think Mark probably agrees with me. I'll put him on the spot because he's playing with his phone back there. He's not even looking up. So just assume he's nodding and saying, yes, Jason, you're right. I seriously have never run into a problem where there's been some API that I needed to use that did not exist in Xamarin. They are all completely wrapped and available to you. The worst case scenario is sometimes you run into one that is not documented well because no one's just ever tried to use it, and you like anything, if you're the first one to use something, sometimes you're the one who gets to shake the bugs out. But that is really, for all the common things that you would write a line of business app with, I've never really had an issue. Another point about this, the subject, Xamarin is very good about producing, about the support for new APIs when they come out. iOS 10 is going to be, has been announced. It's been in beta for a few months, and in all likelihood will become public next month. I would expect Xamarin to have public support for, they already have beta support for iOS 10. I would expect them to have public support for iOS 10 the same day, within 24 hours. That's been their track record for the last 4 or 5 iOS releases, that they have same-day support. It's a little trickier on the Android side because Android doesn't really do public betas. They tend to do these really just long, drawn-out introduction cycles so Xamarin is always sort of chasing them to keep up. But at the same time, the rate of adoption among the Xamarin public, among the Android public is also much, much lower. Whereas within months, you'll see the majority of iOS users jump to the newest version of iOS. With Android, the adoption rate is much, much slower because they have to wait for vendor support for their devices. So that's really not as much of an issue on the Android side. I think I've said all this stuff. I don't need to cover all that again. So we talked about Xamarin Classic, Xamarin Platform, sort of the 1.0 approach that Xamarin introduced. And about 2 years ago, they introduced a new technology called Xamarin Forms. Now, Xamarin Forms ups the shared code story by allowing you to write your UI once and have it render natively on every platform. And you still have the shared backend. Now you also have shared UI. And theoretically, you can get by with very little platform code. All out of the box, all you really need to have is for each platform, you'll have a project that does nothing but initialize forms and load the initial UI. Now, in a real project of any size, you're probably going to have more platform-specific stuff that goes beyond what Forms provides, and we'll talk about how that works. But you still get a much higher level of code sharing across all the different platforms, and it supports Android, iOS, and Windows 10 Universal Windows projects, so phone, desktop, everything that UWP covers. So this is sort of the Xamarin 2.0 approach. Nothing about the traditional platform approach has been deprecated. It's still there, still fully supported, fully developed. Everything Forms does is built on top of the Xamarin Platform code. So they are both completely sensible choices for your development. One does not, negate the other. There are some. I have, since Forms came out, I've tended to do all of my work in Forms because I get a lot more bang for my buck for my development time out of that, and I can deliver more to my client for less money. But if I needed to, if I had a client that really only wanted an iOS project, I would just hop back into Xamarin iOS and do it that way, and not worry about the cross-platform stuff I get from Forms. But it's sort of like with Microsoft, they have ASP.classic, and then they have ASP.NET, and they had ASP.NET, Web Forms, and then they have ASP.NET MVC. They've gradually introduced more and more ways to do web development, but when they do that, they don't deprecate the old ways. You can still write, I'm sure, if you wanted to, ASP Classic code in Visual Studio 2015. I hope you're not doing that, but it is still viable and supported. So what Xamarin Forms provides is basically this collection of UI abstractions. They have pages, they have containers that are layouts, different layout containers, and they have all these different controls. And these are things that you would have in really any UI kit you wrote for any platform, whether it's web or desktop or mobile. You have labels and text boxes and tables and pickers and buttons, all this common stuff that really exists everywhere. And what Forms does is abstracts it out so that you write a Forms UI, you say, I have a button and a label and a text box. And then Forms builds that, and on Android it says, okay, I'm going to put an Android text view and an Android label and an Android button. It's going to look like Android does. And on iOS, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to use the native iOS control, and it's going to look like iOS does. So you define the UI once, but it renders natively on every platform. So you get a native platform experience, but you only have to write the code once. I blew through the slides really fast. Well, maybe not that fast, pretty fast. So before I go further, if there are questions, comments, things y'all want to discuss, are we all on board? Is anyone awake at all? because there's nothing I like more than doing live coding at 9 in the morning in front of a crowd of people, you know, because there's just no way that ever goes wrong. So what I'm going to do, what I'm going to attempt to do, and we'll see how badly this goes, I'm going to create a new solution in Xamarin Studio. I'm doing this on a Mac. I'm running Xamarin Studio on a Mac, which is Xamarin's IDE. We're going to create a new solution. If any of y'all who were in Mark's talk on Friday will notice that he and I have both stolen our sample project from the same place, from Xamarin. Xamarin has a really excellent samples library of apps that will show you how to use different technologies. This is one of their evangelist, James, wrote to do a weather app. So I'm going to create a new solution in Xamarin Studio. You can do, if you're running a Mac, you can use Xamarin Studio on a Mac to write Android and iOS apps. If you are using Visual Studio on a PC, you can write iOS, Android, and Windows apps on the PC. The one caveat being is that for the iOS piece of it, you have to have a Mac somewhere on your network to be a build server, because Xamarin relies on all of the build tools and the build chain that Apple produces. And Apple only produces those tools for the Mac. So you have to have a Mac in order to do iOS development, but you can do it from a Visual Studio with a Mac in the background. I tend to 100% use Xamarin Studio. I rarely do any Windows development. When I do, I just fire up a virtual machine. I like Xamarin Studio. It's a very pared down IDE compared to Visual Studio, but it does what I need it to do, and it's performant. Yeah.
Is Xamarin Studio free as well?
Yes. If you have a, excuse me, if you have the Visual Studio license, Xamarin Studio comes with it. So.
And when you say Visual Studio license, that doesn't mean like Visual Studio Community Edition.
You can do Xamarin with Visual Studio Community. I don't know, I'm not 100% sure on the details of every single licensing scenario. Yeah, the general rule of thumb is this: if you have a Visual Studio license, if you have an MSDN account, even better, you can do Xamarin with it. So we're going to, we created a blank Xamarin Forms app. We're going to run it. Let's see what we get. That's the finished version of the app. This is going to be the blank version of the app. So this is out of the box what you get with Xamarin Forms. You get a nice little hello world type page. And you can see it running on the iOS simulator right there. And we can also do it on Droid. Droid takes longer a little bit, but not that much. And there's our huge, not scaled down Droid simulator. It's still deploying in the background, so that's why it's still taking so long. So there it is on Droid, the same code on both platforms. Very exciting to see a label drawn on two different platforms with one code base, I know. Woo! But what I want to point out, though, really is, okay, we've got this blank solution we just created, and if you look at it, if you don't know anything about iOS, you don't know anything about Android, you're doing this for the first time, you're going to see we have a solution. The solution contains projects. There's a shared PCL project, a Droid project, an iOS project. every project has components and packages and references. It's got some CS files. It has packages config. It's got resources. It's got all of the stuff that you expect and know and are familiar with as a .NET developer. There's a few things in here that probably you don't know what they are. You don't know what a storyboard is. You don't know what a plist is. But the overall structure of a solution is the same as it is in Visual Studio. The way a project is built is the same, or the way the things within a project are the same. If you look at a code file, this is the main Android code file. You'll see, even if you don't know anything about Android, you've got all your using statements, you've got namespaces, you've got attributes, public classes, protected methods. It's all the C# stuff you know. So it's a very familiar experience with just a lot of new stuff mixed in. But kind of the analogy I like to make is if you've been doing this long enough and you made you started off maybe as a .NET desktop developer back in the day, and then you made the transition to web. When you did that, you got to take all the stuff you knew about C# and .NET and the framework with you to the web, but you had to learn a lot of new stuff too. You had to learn the request response model, and you had to learn JavaScript, and you had to learn client versus server, and how to deal with a stateless protocol. So there was a learning curve in the stuff you picked up, but you also built on top of a lot of stuff you already knew. And it's a similar experience with Xamarin, where you have to understand some of the nuances of every platform. You have to think differently about having a much reduced amount of real estate for your UI, but the basic elements of the language and the things you're familiar with are already there, and you can build on top of them. So the basic way a Forms app is structured is that all the meat of it lives up here in this shared PCL project. And if we look at it, we'll see there's this app.xaml file where it's basically saying, on startup, I want to create this COTBW, Code of the Beach Weather page, and I want to assign that to my main page. And if we look at Code on the Beach Weather, we'll see that it's a XAML page containing a label, and there's a code behind, and the code behind probably has nothing in it, initialized component. So that's the shared code. And then in each platform project, if we look at iOS, if we look at the app delegate file, and if you know anything about iOS, you know app delegate is sort of the entry point for all iOS apps. And app delegate, our class is inheriting from the Xamarin Forms application, and then we're initializing Xamarin Forms, and then we're loading a new instance of app, which is in our shared PCL, and that's it. That's basically the bootstrapping of Forms. And it's the same thing in the Android app. Android generally has a main activity, which is the main entry point for the app. It does the same thing here. The Android app just inherits from Xamarin Forms application. It does the init of the Forms engine, and then it loads a new instance of our application. We'll just wait and see how many times I trip over that before I faceplant. So that's the basic, simple architecture of a Forms app. You have an entry point in each platform, and then that shared code that defines your UI. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to go create some more complex UI. So we're going to go up in our shared project. We're going to add a new folder. We're going to call it view. We're going to create a new page. Forms content page, XAML. We're going to call it forecast. And we're going to create another one. Page. And So we're going to go. So every Xamarin Forms allows you to use XAML. So if you're a WPF or even a Silverlight dev, you should be familiar with XAML. Similar to HTML, it should have a a declarative way of laying out your UI and also provides you a code behind. To programmatically interact with it, it has data binding engine, so you can do data binding, which we'll examine in a little more detail. The syntax of it is different than WPF. Just like WPF and Silverlight are not identical in their XAML markup syntax, the Forms syntax is very different. So you can't just cut and paste your WPF XAML and reuse it in Forms. But if you understand the mechanisms of it, you can reuse that knowledge to build your pages and get the same general benefits that you would from using XAML in any platform. You don't have to use XAML if you want to just write your code, write your UI in code. You can do it that way, just programmatically. There we go. When I first started doing this, I was very much a code it all in the back end kind of guy. And then over time, I've come to appreciate the XAML approach a little more. It gives you some benefits about keeping your separation of concerns between your UI and your back end. And also, as it's evolved, it's gotten some better tooling in terms of doing styles and things that allow you to kind of control how your UI appears without having to do a lot of code.
Is there a preview for this, kind of like the way it is in WPF and Android Studio, and I assume iOS development?
The question is there a previewer? There actually is. It is now. It was an alpha release after the Evolve conference in April. I think it's now made it up to the beta cycle, but it's not in the stable release yet, so I don't have it loaded. But it basically does allow you just to preview your XAML page, do a live preview as you code your XAML. It's not an interactive drag and drop type designer, but it is a live previewer. So that's something people have been asking for a long time, and they finally got it working. And it looks really good. I've played with it a little bit. It's really performant and allows you to switch between the different platforms to see how the rendering is a little different between them. So I'm expecting sometime this year probably it would come out into the stable cycle. So we're going to go in here and what are we going to do? We're going to modify our app XAML to use those 2 new pages we created. I don't know. For some reason, Intellisense is acting like it doesn't know what I'm doing, but yeah, pretty sure this is all kosher. That's one of the downsides of Xamarin Studio is it's not as fully baked as Visual Studio is. So now we're going to change this and assign our main page to be an instance of this tab. Actually, we're going to do nav. If there's ever a time you really want Intellisense to go wrong on you, it's when you're doing a demo and you really need it to. What did I do? Wow. Page equals nav, nav. Oops. Let's try that again. Okay, that's just annoying. That's not right. All right, well, I'm done. That's it. Is the bar open yet? This is when you go to your backup and you load the one that you know works. I think one of the things I love about being a developer, or when I say love, I mean love, is that people who and people in your life, like your family who are not in IT, they assume that you just love the computer, and that you come home you use the computer all day at work, and then you come home and you sit down at the computer and do whatever. They assume that you just love the computer, and they don't realize that how much a developer hates his machine sometimes. There's, it does not do what you want it to do, and that's your whole purpose in life, is to make the machine do what you tell it to do, and sometimes it just won't. And the amount of self-control it takes sometimes not to throw it out the window or just beat it to death is really amazing. I don't think non-IT people in our lives appreciate that sometimes. So anyway. So this is what the end result of where we're going looks like, and we'll just, instead of building it as we go, we'll step backwards and look at what it takes to make that work. But so again, the bulk of the work going on here is all in this PCL app, so it's all shared code. What we have is we have a model that's basically we're grabbing weather data from OpenWeather. So this is basically just a model based on the OpenWeather JSON we're getting back using newtonstuff.json, which is a great JSON parsing engine. So this is all pretty standard, portable model, business layer type code. And then we have a service which basically calls the OpenWeather map, passes in our key, our token, and our location data, and gets back the JSON and parses it for us using the model that we built. And then we have a view model, because we're using the MVVM pattern, which is sort of what Forms encourages. Just like you would, you don't have to necessarily, but it's really built that way to make the best use of data binding. That's really what you want to use. So we have a view model, which basically has properties and getters and setters for all the things that are on the page about the flag to use GPS, the text box for our location, whether or not we're using imperial or English units, or imperial or metric, I guess. And then it has basically just a reference to this the weather forecast object, which is that big JSON data model we have. And then it has some tasks in here to actually call the weather service. And all that then is then wired up through our views. And if we look at our view, like the weather page, which is that main page, all it has in it is it's a content page, has some stack layouts, which are just vertical containers of controls. They can be horizontal too. And they can be nested. So we have a stack layout, a text box for our location, another stack layout with a label and a switch, another stack layout with a label and a switch, a button and some labels for setting our results or displaying our results. And I mean, again, even if you don't know anything about Xamarin Forms or Xamarin or iOS, you can read 90% of that and figure out what's going on. You know, it's markup syntax. It's pretty straightforward. And we are using data binding, though. That's, I guess, relevant to talk about. So, and I assume, is everyone familiar with like binding, like you use in WPF? Yeah, okay. This is the same basic concept. It's not quite as evolved as, it doesn't have all of the features that WPF binding does, but we're getting there slowly. So we're just binding, for all of our controls, we're binding the things that are in our view model. And if we look at our code behind for this page, our code behind literally does nothing but call the initialize function. There's no logic there to drive any of this. It's all done declaratively through the markup and then the view model. And if we look at our app XAML, which is the kind of root of our app XAML CS, which is sort of the root of our project, we'll see that it's setting a binding context right there to the view model. And the binding context, every page, every data-aware element in Forms has a binding context. And I think this is true in WPF too, but it's been so long since I've done any, I'm not certain. But the binding context flows downwards. So if you assign a binding context at the root level or at the page level, everything in that page is going to inherit that binding context. So you don't have to assign it element by element. If there's a specific element you want to have a different binding context, you can override it easily, but otherwise it just flows downwards. So this is the only place in the entire app where we're assigning the binding context. We're setting it to the view model so that in our page back here, all this stuff is just bound to properties that are on the view model, and you know, we can even we can do things like we can bind an invisible property so that when we're getting our data from the service, we can display a spinner to show that there's some activity happening. We can bind colors. We can bind text values. You can bind bind more than just the obvious text property of a control. There's a lot of properties on the control that are bindable. So you can set up support some behaviors. So you can even set up things where the value of one control, if you have a toggle switch, will then just change the visibility of other controls. So you can do some pretty complex things just through binding and through markup. And then the other, let's run this again, look at the other page. So we have a tab set down here, and it's using the iOS standard tabs at the bottom. Whoops, to go get the forecast first. There's our isVisible spinner. And when it's done, if it finishes, my network connection didn't time out. Oh, there it worked. So, ooh, it's heavy, intense rain at my house. That's what I like. I can't. And it's cool too. That's kind of interesting. It's also 9 in the morning in Houston, but that's usually pretty hot by 9 in the morning already. But it'll be good and humid when I get back. That's what I really enjoy. Plus, I did turn my sprinklers off, so I've been paying to water my lawn even though it's raining. But if we look at this forecast page, then this has a little different view. It shows us the forecast over the next few days. That's actually kind of nice. That's good. This will be the last week of summer for my kids, so I'll actually be able to send them outside and make them play in the fresh air. It's not so hot. But if we look at this other forecast page, it's similar, and it's just got markup with no code behind. Yep, no code behind. But the difference here is that we're using a Lisp view, and a Lisp view is a data bindable element that uses a template to display a list of items. Obviously, that's why it's called a list view. There are some built-in data templates you can use. If you're doing simple things, you can just use one of the built-in templates, or you can define your own, like we're doing here with the view template. And basically, for every cell, we're just saying it's going to have a stack layout with an image. The image is going to display the icon based on what the weather is going to be, and then some labels to display the the details of the forecast. And it'll render one of those for every element in the list. And did we leave it running? We didn't leave it running. And then we will we'll run this side by side with the Droid version, which I think works. I say that it probably doesn't now. It's gonna crash and burn just to embarrass me. While we're waiting for this to build, Forms out of the box, gives you a lot of built-in controls, a lot of built-in functions to do cross-platform development without having to write a lot of platform-specific code. But there are times when you need to or want to write platform-specific code. And real quick, we'll just look at this. So this is the Droid app. You can see it behaves and functions very much the same. It looks a little different because it's using the Droid standard of tabs at the top. I think the color scheme is a little bit different. But overall, it's the same basic experience on both platforms without having to write any custom code for each platform. But if you do need to write custom code for a platform, and if you're doing a project of any size, you will. Forms is very well designed to allow you to do that. It gives you there's two main mechanisms you can use to do that. There's a built-in dependency injection service. So if you want to have, for instance, you want to use the device camera, you can write that code to access the camera in your platform-specific project, define an interface, and then use dependency injection to introduce that into your Forms PCL. So you can access that from your PCL code. The other mechanism it provides is what are called custom renderers. And basically that's where you define a widget of whatever type you want, and then you, in each platform, you write platform-specific code to render that widget. So I could have, some custom view I needed to have that I was not able to composite out of. Actually, let me back up. Probably a good example is a map view, because the maps on each platform are fairly different. So if I wanted to have a map view, and there is a built-in map view with Forms, but it's not incredibly full-featured. If I wanted to have a more full-featured map view, I could write my own map control in Forms, or I could define it in Forms, and then provide an implementation for it in Android and iOS. And then Forms would know on each platform to call the appropriate renderer. And that's how Forms itself is built. And Forms also will expose its own renderers to you. So if you have, a label control, and you want to create a custom label, for your error messages, you can inherit from the built-in label renderer, and then provide your own custom implementation on each platform to tweak it a little bit if you wanted to. There's also a very pretty full-featured ecosystem of third-party form stuff. There are a lot of NuGet packages out there that you can use to do stuff. There's this concept Xamarin's introduced called, I'm going to draw a complete blank on it now. Plugins, which are basically, they're generally distributed as NuGet packages, but they're for very kind of isolated pieces of cross-platform functionality. So they're not big packages that provide you with lots of stuff. They're small packages that are very targeted. For instance, there's a package, a plugin called Xamarin.media, which basically gives you a single API that allows you to access the camera platform on every platform without having to write your own platform-specific code. There's a GPS plugin that lets you access the GPS without having to write platform-specific code. There are a lot of things like that that are open source, written by third parties. There are also commercial toolkits from a lot of the major component vendors like Telerik and Grape City, and all the the big 5 or 6 of the .NET component vendors are beginning to provide components for forms, which is pretty exciting. So we did all that. I think we have like, what, 10 minutes left, something like that? 8 minutes left. So that's the majority of what I wanted to talk about. Like I said, kind of my goal here, which I think maybe I accomplished, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I wanted y'all to see kind of the broad picture of what Xamarin provides, what all the different pieces of Xamarin are. It's not just a single technology. There's a couple of different approaches you can use to write code, to write apps in Xamarin. And I wanted you to see the actual coding process, to see that it's, if you're a .NET developer, it's not identical to what you're used to, but it's a very familiar process. And it can be a little intimidating to get started, but it's not that difficult. You can do it. I was a regular .NET guy, and I talked my way into a project doing this, and here I am now. So. Yeah, the publishing process, he was asking about tools to help you publish. The publishing process to get them onto the app stores for Google and Apple is very much controlled by the vendors themselves, but there are tools built into Xamarin Studio. Let's see if I can show you, that help you package them and get them ready. You do archive for publishing, which, oh, come on. Yeah. This is not going to be very friendly, but there's an archive for publishing tool which works on both Droid and iOS projects, which helps you, kind of walks you through getting your configuration set up for each platform, for getting it built, for packaging it. It will do some sanity checks to be sure you have all the right things enabled. And
it just kind of helps you build the artifacts with no real integration.
Well, no, it does, but then ultimately it'll build. There's an archive manager in the IDE that will then show you the archive packages and then let you I think for Google, it will actually upload it to the App Store for you. It'll upload the binary to the App Store for you, and then you just have to log into your App Store account and then push it to release. For iOS, it gets you to the point where you need to use the Apple application loader, which then loads your binary to the App Store for you. So it's pretty good. I mean, it's pretty helpful because the whole process is kind of involved. So it helps simplify some of that. It doesn't completely solve all the pain, but it's helpful.
Does Apple and Google seem kind of cooperative with this whole concept of it, or are they kind of fighting?
To the best of my knowledge, Apple and Google are benignly indifferent to Xamarin. If you'd asked me, a year ago, because there's been a very popular idea for a long time among the Xamarin crowd that Microsoft will buy them, and for the longest time, I said no, I didn't think it would ever happen, because I really thought that Microsoft buying them would then turn them from benignly indifferent to actively aggressive against the Xamarin platform. So I obviously was wrong. But from what I can tell, they're still pretty much benignly indifferent to Xamarin. From the Xamarin people I've talked to, they've said that we have no under the cover access to anyone at Apple or Google. We just we're like any other vendor, third-party vendor. We have the normal channel access that anyone does. We don't get special previews of software or anything like that. So, I've never had any problem getting an app into the App Store because of the fact that I'm using Xamarin. I've never had any problems with the view process because I'm using Xamarin. I've never had any technical issues because I'm using Xamarin. So, I think that if you're worried about is there going to be blowback because you're writing apps with Xamarin versus the native platform.
Not so much writing, but I was just wondering if in the future would they be kind of cooperative?
Yeah, I mean, my best guess would be in the future they're going to continue like they are now, and they're just going to kind of ignore it. Yeah.
So for some of these UI things like your list view, coming from a native standpoint, looking at switching over, I know that like iOS would do things like EQing table cells if you have like 1,000 rows,
right.
On the screen. Does something like this take advantage of that when it compiles over?
So the question is, the things like list view, do they take advantage of the native performance tweaks that a native control would? The general answer is yes, and specifically in the case of list view, I know that they have, because that can be easily become a huge performance hog. They are under the covers doing some caching for you. And I think they even expose a little bit of the caching mechanism too, so that you have a little bit of control over it. I've never really played with that. But they are trying to make it as performant as possible on each platform by doing whatever is appropriate on each platform. There's always gotchas and things they miss, but it's out of the box. I mean, it's designed to be as performant as possible. I'm sure you can find edge cases where it will blow up, and you would need to do something different.
Question about persistence in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming you can write like a SQLite persistence layer. And
Right.
But can you use Entity Framework?
No, you cannot use Entity Framework. Sort of the go-to solution for persistence on the device is SQLite because it's supported everywhere. There's also a newer thing out there called Realm.io, which now has Xamarin support, which I've heard good things about. I haven't actually tried it. You cannot use Entity Framework. I mean, my experience with Entity Framework is that it is a huge beast and not something you would want to run on a mobile device. SQLite has its own sort of ORM layer. It's not anywhere near as good as Entity Framework, but it's also not nearly as big as Entity Framework. Yeah. Yeah, so the built-in SQLite ORM is what a lot of people tend to use. That's what I've always used. I want to try out Realm when I find a good project to try it out with, but so far SQLite's been it. Are we out of time? Do we have? Yep, we're out of time. So thanks for coming. I have business cards up. Oh, hey, whoa, whoa. Okay, here comes the Great Monkey giveaway. So.